Shabbat Shalom. What is a nesher? The Hebrew word nesher. That's one of those good words because it's one of those words that everybody always gets wrong when they think they know a little bit of Hebrew. If I were to ask you, what is a dog? Fish. Very good. What is what's a chatul? Kev. Very good. Nesher, up in the air, usually translated as an eagle. This is a little bit too much. Let's try down there. We'll see if that's, well, I can hear it ringing in my ears, and I don't think that's tinnitus. It's usually translated as an eagle. In fact, if you were reading along with the song of Haazinu, you may have even heard it mentioned. Even in the JPS translation, which went out of its ways to translate other things more bizarrely, they stuck with the eagle translation for the nesher, which I can understand, because the imagery that's found there in Haazinu is that God will carry us like an eagle with its young. That's pretty striking, a beautiful image, right? But then when you begin to look into the actual zoology of the biblical times, you look into the other references to the nesher throughout the rest of Tanakh, and you try to identify precisely what species is this. After all, not all eagles are the same. It turns out it's not an eagle at all. It's a vulture. The griffin vulture, to be precise, by most modern scholarly investigations. The nesher should be translated as the griffin vulture. However, if you are a European Jew, living sometime during the Middle Ages or later, and you have never seen a griffin vulture in your life, you've never seen any of the animals that actually only live in the Middle East, and you're thinking of what is the bird that's clearly an impressive bird, because it's mentioned impressively in multiple parts of the Bible, well, you don't get more impressive than eagles, do you? So therefore, it's an eagle. There's only one problem. Do eagles go around carrying their young on their back? No. Not so much. Or do they? So it turns out that both the griffin vulture as well as some other species of birds do, in rare circumstances, keep their young on their back. Sometimes it's while the fledgling is learning how to fly, and when it looks like it's about to crash and fall, the mother will swoop underneath it and the bird will rest on its back, regaining its strength. Sometimes it is more like the biblical version of the mother will pick them up and sort of scoot them onto the back to make a rest stop for some other spot that they're moving to. It turns out it's not common, but rare. Now, until these observations were made in the modern world with more ornithologists out there actually studying this and precisely, during the Enlightenment period, as translations got going and as biblical criticism was at its height, people would point to the phrase of carrying us like an eagle carries its young on its back as clearly showing that this was fake, that the Bible was wrong. Sure, a human might make that mistake, but would God? Doesn't God know how birds carry their young? And there were a number of explanations given in the meantime, prior to the modern observations that, yeah, it can happen. And the various explanations worked quite well. That this was, of course, poetic, it was metaphorical, it was not meant to be taken literally, the standard explanations that are used. It was also simply explained that it was speaking in the language of man. This is a common explanation for many parts of the Torah that seem to be difficult. God having a hand, for example, or God having a face. That this is just the language that's necessary for the transcendent to be understood by the very limited physical creatures that are receiving Torah. But why would God choose this metaphor? The argument went, well, because it's what people thought happened. And because people thought that's what happened, God used the idioms of the common man in order that he and she would be able to relate to the text. And if it's no longer a common idiom, well, you know, that's the problem with not changing the text. It doesn't get updated for times. Same thing happens with Shakespeare, Homer, and many of the other greats. The idioms no longer work. But it turns out it wasn't an idiom. It turns out this does actually happen. And it turns out we don't know as much as we think we know, neither about Torah, which for centuries people were translating nesher incorrectly as being a regular type of eagle, or about the natural world around us, which for many centuries people believed did not contain birds that carried their young on their back. Why does this matter? Well, let me give you the second topic that we need to unravel for today in Haazinu. The bigger mystery of Haazinu: how long is Haazinu? You saw when we did Hagba and the Torah was lifted, Haazinu looks weird, right? If you're looking in your own Chumash, you'll see it looks weird. And exactly, it's printed in this strange, justified double column pattern for the two columns usually that it takes up on a Sefer Torah. How long is it? Well, you just have to measure, right? Well, yes and no. You see, there's actually differing traditions of exactly how long it is. The earliest manuscripts of Rambam, for example, which were based upon the Aleppo Codex, which is the oldest extant complete Torah that is still known, says that it was 67 lines long. 67 breaks, if you will, in the text in order to make it fit into that format. However, many modern texts will have it be 70 lines long. So the question is, don't they know their Rambam? Don't they trust Maimonides to have gotten it right when he said it was 67? Well, there's a problem, because for many, many hundreds of years, most copies of Rambam that most people had said 70 rather than 67. An error had crept into the Rambam, probably deliberately, by communities that had the tradition of 70 lines for their Haazinu, which was another alternative tradition even at the time the Aleppo Codex was written. And those communities said, oh, well, Rambam must have gotten this wrong. It must have been 70, and they edited him in order to make it right. So now you end up with two versions of Rambam, one saying 67, his original, and the other saying the corrected 70, and then people not understanding why in some communities there are 67, in other communities there are 70 lines for Haazinu. We don't always know as much as we think we know, but we can know a little more. See, this is what I find to be one of the most fascinating and ennobling parts of being part of the conservative movement. Because as much as we call it the conservative movement, and as much as the word conservative has a whole host of baggage in the modern language, that is not exactly probably the best term for what really goes on when, as conservative Jews, we investigate our traditions and our practice. Conservative Judaism says, you know what, I would like to know which kind of bird this is. I'm not just going to keep calling it an eagle because that's the word that's been used for the last 500 years in the European communities from which many of our people come. I would actually like to find out if there is a better translation for this word. And if it had a legal significance in halakha, that would matter. Likewise, just because a lot of copies of Rambam say 70, that doesn't mean it's right if I find earlier manuscripts that are written in Rambam's own hand that say 67, then there's a mystery to be unraveled, and one that we can investigate of whether or not we should update the way that a Sefer Torah is written to make sure that it matches the 67 or 70. There are good justifications for both traditions, by the way. 67 or 70 are both kosher Torahs, so we don't need to worry about checking that. But it is something that was worth checking out initially to ensure that the Torah was indeed being transmitted faithfully and carefully. And you see, this is something that Judaism has done for a few thousand years, going all the way back to the time of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, the great academies that came after the even greater rabbis Hillel and Shammai, for which they were named. Those academies did not agree on a lot. And if you think for just a moment, how can it be that the two academies of the two great rabbis would disagree on more than the two great rabbis themselves disagreed on? Then you're asking the right questions. Surely it is meant to be that over time, the number of arguments will decrease as we resolve issues and investigate and settle. Not so, says our tradition. Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, unfortunately, despite their great size, were a little befuddled of not being as good of students as the teachers from which they came. And so as they tried to recall the precise teachings of their progenitors, as they tried to implement those into halakha cases, they kept running up against obstacles with their opponents, not because the rabbis that had begun the academies would have disagreed, but because the students did not understand how to reconcile the two versions they received, which were in harmony, but not when seen by those students. And so a period of reconciliation was needed, which unfortunately was interrupted by the destruction of the First Temple, and then by the revolt against Rome, and then the fall of Beitar. And it meant that much of the oral Torah became extremely confused, with different traditions and different opinions abounding throughout the community, as people remembered bits and pieces of what their teachers had said, sometimes imperfectly, which is what becomes known as the Breitot, and sometimes perfectly, but misunderstanding the implications, which is why eventually, in around the year 250, during a period of relative peace, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi went through, gathered all of the traditions that were available to him at the time, discussed and sorted with all of the great sages of the time, and organized the oral Torah into one cohesive body, which we call the Mishnah, in order to try and synthesize and remove the doubts and discussions and debates. Of course, you can't completely get rid of doubts, discussions, and debates. There were still these other bits of fragments going around, these other ways of expressing the same idea that the Mishnah taught, these Breitot. And so they needed to also be reconciled, understood, examined, sometimes discounted, and that then becomes one of the main tasks of the Talmud, to make sure that we're investigating. And this process was alive and well for many, many centuries, almost 1,000 years worth of continued investigation, discussion, looking into science to make sure that we understood the implications, looking into the culture to make sure we understood the implications, looking into comparative theology, what were other religions doing so we could understand what idolatry was. These investigations and examinations of our own texts and the world around us produced the great fruit that allowed our people to continue to live a Jewish life no matter where we ended up, whether there were eagles in the sky or whether there were vultures. However, over time, our adherence and our dedication to investigation, to be willing to re-examine cases in light of new evidence, began to dwindle. Mostly beginning with ghetto experience and the subjugation under the failing Muslim empires in the Middle Eastern areas, we began to stop asking so many questions and investigating, and began to simply say, how do we get by? How do we preserve? How do we make sure that we don't lose what we have? And over the time, that became a very stale version of Judaism. It was a version which eventually led to the Musar movement breaking out, to the Hasidic movement breaking out, to the Reform movement breaking out, to the Haskalah movement breaking out, to Zionism breaking out, and yes, eventually the conservative movement as well. For among all of those other views, our view was, let's reopen our examinations. Let's return to being willing to look at older books and see if their versions, their manuscripts, their copies don't contain printer errors, don't contain mistakes, and maybe that can help us understand. Let's dig through the Cairo Geniza and re-examine our understanding of prayer and how it evolved over the centuries. Let us compare the Dead Sea Scrolls to the modern texts and see where things might have changed, whether they had 67 lines or 70 lines for Haazinu. Let us go out and examine either the archaeology or the biology of Eretz Israel and see whether or not an understanding of its wildlife, of its topography, of its geography, of its hydrology, of all of those things can change how we understand the different rulings and teachings of our sages. Which means that the conservative movement has tried to reboot the process that ground to a halt a few hundred years ago, about 500 or so. And for that I am eternally grateful. Now that does mean that we upset people from time to time, because, you know, we change. But we're not changing, we are returning. We are resuming a process. It would be like somebody complaining that that house next door got a fresh coat of paint, But that house next door has always been dilapidated. Yeah, because it was, pardon the expression, neglected in many ways. But to go in and say, what was the original paint of this wall? For someone to scrape through the muck and the grime and find that chip underneath, to do an analysis to see exactly what was its chemical composition, how was it made, and then to reproduce that and be able to return that wall to its former glory and luster, that is what the conservative movement is about. And it's about also making sure that that house will situate itself comfortably in the modern world, to continue to stretch the analogy. That if the landscape around it has changed, the house will still be a house, but we'll have to perhaps extend the driveway a little bit. We might need to push back a hedge on that side. We have to check the drainage, especially if that house is in Florida, because wherever the house is built, it has to also fit in that environment, as Judaism has done. But it only works when we do that with a process of investigation and understanding, of examining both our own texts and the world in which they lived, and examining our lives and the world in which we live. And by bringing these examinations together, by being careful not to change or uproot anything simply out of convenience or of custom or of preference, but only in order to make sure that the house will be on a good foundation for the next generation and the next and the next, as well as being able to attribute its full understanding and construction back to the original architecture, that is what the conservative movement is. So when you see changes around you, do not see them as being changes, see them as being a continuation. Just as we would not want to freeze a child which is growing at one point in their life, but hope that they will continue to grow and learn and be better, so too, our faith continues to grow and learn and be better, without ever losing sight of Torah, without ever losing sight of the heart of what Judaism is, without ever losing sight of halakha. It is a process, not a revolution, but it is a process that is always in motion if we're paying attention. I see a hand. Those are eagles, because they were considered to be a powerful symbol, and when people were making powerful symbols to put onto rimonim or other Jewish decorations, the eagle was often chosen by European artists because eagles are cool, and we all know that. And unfortunately, in the European language, vultures, just that word, is a dirty word. It fills people with revulsion unless you're like really, really cool about, carrion birds. And we don't realize that it's a taxonomy, it's not a lifestyle. And we should not look down upon one version of bird compared to another. But yes, we continue to use many symbols and signs that are inherited from the Middle Ages, where many things were changed due to lack of information and insight, as well as changing circumstances. And we do so without knowing and imagine that it is eternal. Just one last thing, because it is very topical. When Cantor Dubrow and I were talking about putting things together for the holidays and discussing melodies and all of that, one of the topics that routinely comes up, both with him as well as anyone else who has studied cantorial liturgy, is a lot of melodies you think are eternal are relatively new. Some of them less than 100 years, some of them less than 200 years, very, very few more than a couple hundred years old. And yet we act as though they are Misinai, from Mount Sinai itself, as though everyone has always been chanting and singing this passage in that way. And then, of course, we also have to remember the words themselves from most of our liturgy is not from Misinai unless it is a quote that has been incorporated into a larger text. This is a process. This is something that we continue to work on, and something that should call to all of us. Shabbat Shalom.